Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Utah Leads Together webinar. I'm Derek Miller. I'm the president and CEO of the Salt Lake Chamber. We're delighted to have you all with us, and especially delighted to have a distinguished panel and moderator today. In just a moment, I'll turn the time over to Boyd Matheson, the opinion editor at the Deseret News, and I'll let him introduce our panelists. We're grateful to have each one of them with us and to spend a few minutes talking about an important topic. In addition to welcoming you, I wanted to just give a little bit of background about why the Salt Lake Chamber has decided to host this webinar, and specifically on the topic of the strength of Utah's economy and what challenges may lie ahead and what we can do to overcome them. A few weeks ago, probably like many of you, we were noticing the nice accolades that were coming in for our capital city, for our communities around the state, and for the entire state of Utah. Just to name a few of them, the Milken Institute recently released their rankings of the top metro cities by the strength of their economy. Provo-Orem area was #1, Salt Lake City was #4, and Ogden-Clearfield was #9. It's pretty remarkable to have 3 of our major cities in Utah in the top 10. In addition to that, the Wall Street Journal recently did a quantitative analysis showing that the Salt Lake metro area was the fastest growing job growth in the country. And of course, the list could go on and on about the good recognition, accolades that the state is receiving. However, I think it's critical that whenever we see that recognition, that we ask ourselves an important question, and that question is why? Why is that happening? And that's why we've gathered this panel today, as we considered not just what is happening, but why are those things happening. We thought there'd be no better group to answer the why behind the what than a great group of reporters who are covering Utah's economy, what's happening in business, what's happening in our communities every single day. And as I mentioned, not just the good things that are happening, but also challenges that we may be facing as a result of the positive growth in our economy and our population. And so we're grateful to have each and every one of them with us. Boyd, thank you for moderating this group. And with that, I'll turn the time over to you.
Thank you, Derek, and we're very excited to be with everybody today. And this is one of those important conversations that I think, especially for the business community, we always say the most dangerous day in the life of an organization is the day they hit #1. It's the day you have that success. And both as a state and in our business community, we are getting very used to those we're #1 accolades. Which is both a great thing. We want to talk about why that's happening, what's happening there, and then more importantly, how do we sustain it, that we don't drift into the mediocrity or status quo or being content with where we are, because that's the fastest way to get wiped out by someone else who's hungry and really going after that excellence. Thrilled to have just an awesome panel with us today. Art Raymond from the Deseret News with his great focus on the tech sector. Jason Lee, of course, is award-winning business writer for the Deseret News. Really excited to have Ginger Chin, Vice President of Policy for the Salt Lake Chamber, a new slot. Many of you are familiar with Ginger in other roles, but we're grateful to have her as part of this panel today. And then, of course, the wordsmith, Holly Richardson, joining us from Utah Policy. We were talking before we came on. I know it's how all of us begin our day with breakfast. So we're glad to have Holly chiming in as well. And so let's jump right into it. A lot of ground to cover. And Art, I'm going to lead off with you as we look at what is going on. Of course, as Derek mentioned, some great "we're number one" moments. And I want to ask you, not so much are you surprised? I don't know that any of us are surprised anymore at these, but coming out of the pandemic in particular, is there anything that maybe you were thinking, I wonder if this will hold through the pandemic in terms of our success in the state?
Well, I think we've got a running start. Our trough wasn't nearly as deep as almost anybody else's, and job growth barely waned. The Wall Street Journal story that Derek mentioned, pointed out that the resilience carried throughout. I mean, that was a look at 2020 data, and we just never. Our foot stayed on the gas, collectively speaking. If you look at state tax revenue rolls, there was a budget surplus. Mount West Capital just released their annual deal report, another record year for private equity, merger and acquisition. Value volume, number of deals was down, but it's just a further indication of just some high level gusto that Utah's economy has had, and it goes far beyond the tech sector. Obviously, our diverse portfolio plays a role, and I don't think, for me, I didn't really have any doom and gloom sort of sensors going, other than the ones we're looking at, which is it all goes to quality of life issues, traffic's coming back as we return to work, housing is out of control. And we've got some challenges in front of us, but I don't see any hindrances to continued growth. And I think I've heard the same, not just from the business community, but from our local, economic experts as well.
Yeah. Ginger, let me go to you next in terms of just from a policy standpoint. You've been watching this from on top of the hill, now from the lower parts of the hill. How have you seen it? Any surprises for you coming out of the pandemic?
No, not necessarily surprises. I think as a state, we're really forward thinking. And I was really appreciative of our executive branch and how they said, hey, we need to jump on top of this with the pandemic. And I think out of any other state, as we were watching it, from the political perspective through policy and how we were managing, even the budget, as Art mentioned, I think there was a really forward thinking approach. So again, we got a running start, which was wonderful. But even from the policy standpoint, we said, hey, how can we get a running start from this? And so I think that as a state, we were really thinking ahead, and it helped us out quite a bit.
Yeah. Jason, in your coverage of the business community and what's been going on, as we went through the pandemic, what were some of the things that maybe were under the surface that maybe we weren't talking about that might be of interest in our path forward?
I think the biggest thing I can recall, and still is kind of an issue really, is generally speaking, we didn't lose as many jobs, and we were able to recover. Art mentioned this very quickly, which says a lot about the strength of our economy and the diversity as well. However, if you are in hospitality, if you are in food and dining, this is a very difficult time still for you, tourism, because those industries, and though more people are going out, getting people to go back to those jobs has been exceedingly difficult. Now, there's a variety of factors involved in that, but I think until everything comes back, then we can't, tout victory. We want to be as strong as we were before the pandemic, and that may take some time still, and we're almost there. So, I mean, what do you call this? Like a B plus, A minus? We want to get to the A, and until those things are able to, and when people are able to go out and we feel safe, and those industries are, kind of back to normal, I think those are the things that still have some concern for me.
Yeah, definitely no spiking of the ball just yet. We're
right.
we're waiting on that one. Holly, from your unique perch, you often are that intersection between what's going on inside the state and what's happening in terms of national news. How have you seen that in terms of the Utah's business community and business strength?
So I might be one who talks a little bit about the challenges, because what we have seen is that women specifically have lost jobs at twice the rate of the men. Their recovery has been slower. There was a recent study released by the Utah Women in Leadership Project at Utah State University with Dr. Susan Madsen. And what they found was, even though women may still have jobs, the nature of the job had changed. Maybe the pay had changed, the responsibilities maybe had changed. Certainly the emotional demands had changed. And a lot of people, 60% said it was a negative year for them, that they called it a wasted year, or at best a year on pause, right? So I think we can look at the low unemployment rate, but if you start to tease out some of the demographics and how it has impacted communities of color, women, especially, like I said earlier, that those are the areas I think that we could really focus on and measure, because we're looking in the aggregate and we have some specificity that I think we could benefit from.
Yeah, wonderful. I'm going to come back to that in just a minute, Holly, in some of our drill down in terms of the economy and jobs and how that's moving, and some of the lessons learned, I think, during the pandemic in terms of being in an office versus out of an office. Art, I want to go back to you in terms of the tech sector in particular. What have we learned in terms of innovation through the course of the pandemic, both things that we've been able to do well in the state, and maybe some of the things that proved to be more challenging than we thought as it relates to continuing that innovation trend in the state?
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, I think overall, and it's, I'm hesitant to generalize too much because we say tech sector, but we know it actually has a lot of component parts. The closer you look, the more sort of diverse it gets. But for this purpose, we'll say tech sector, and I get where you're going. I think those companies had kind of an advantage in a couple of different areas. If you're a software focused, online focused company, redeploying your workforce or keeping people at home is just a much easier task than so many service companies that, are just structurally unable to make changes like that. Also, the tech community is full of companies that are quick movers. That it's the nature of the startup business to iterate, get past failures. And if that's your mindset as a company, it just sets you up well for taking on something none of us could have seen, unprecedented set of circumstances. So I think overall and generally speaking, our tech sector were and are high performers in the face of some, just extraordinary circumstances. That said, I think, in spite of this really kind of glowing number from, looking at investment deals and M&As over the last year, there was a lot of static kind of underneath that too. We had an extraordinary year because I think there were a handful of super big deals, Ancestry $4+ billion acquisition deal, et cetera. But our local investment community kind of got quiet. They turned inward. It was time for managers to take care of their portfolio companies and maybe slow down on new investments, rolling the dice on a new endeavor. And I think there's been some, maybe if you happen to be in the wrong sort of area of the pipeline, if you were getting ready to, go do your fundraising presentation last March, you've been possibly stalled out. So, some new deals happen, but I think there's this kind of where it's going to take some time to get back to some of what we lost. And it's hard to see what we lost because there's so much high performance in this area kind of overseeing it. But I think it would be fair to say we'd be doing even better. And there's a bunch of investment activity and startup, decision making that got put on hold that I think we're going to start seeing like roll out. And it could be really, really interesting and fun to watch from my perspective, because I think there's going to be a lot of activity in this area over the next 6 months, which again should just continue to bode well for the state.
It'll give you plenty to write about anyway. So.
That's right.
Awesome. Jason, I want to go back to you just as we talk about the employment numbers. Of course, the employment numbers look really good, but there are those people who are either towards the bottom end of that ladder that seem to still be struggling. And then, of course, there's a lot of our entrepreneurs and small business owners that are struggling to fill slots. What are you seeing?
That last part you mentioned, though, Boyd, is very, it's important. And it's also one of those problems that's going under the radar. There are a lot of jobs that are going unfilled an economy that we have more jobs than people. So people are being more selective in the jobs they're taking. And so it might not be even in the same industry that they may have been in before the pandemic started. Maybe because they wanted something with a bit more stability, maybe because they found a way to make a higher wage or they got retrained. There are a variety of reasons why some industries still seem to struggle. What I worry about, honestly, is will those jobs be able to be filled? Because so many people, and again, this is a broad ranging circumstance we have here, because there is more money, some more money in unemployment, not a whole lot, because it doesn't last. That's the problem with it, right? So if you can get a few hundred extra dollars a month, maybe even $1,000, that seems great for a while. But in 6 months, when that runs out, then what do? You have to figure out a way to make a living, and hopefully a livable wage. Wages in general have not really kept up with inflation. Inflation potentially is going to get larger. We've been at 1 or 2% for years now. And right now we're looking at potentially getting up to 3. So there's all these little factors that are going in our favor, but there's a few that can be troubling for the people on the lower end of the economic ladder. And we can't leave them behind. We all, our community, prospers when we all can prosper. What is it? Rising tide lift all boats. Yeah. We have to lift those people up somehow. And we have to figure out how to do that. And right now, I don't know that we've come up with a solution, but I do believe there's some great minds trying to work on that problem.
Yeah, wonderful. Jerry, I wanted to pop over to you on what we've learned in terms of the policy standpoint. Jason mentioned things like unemployment, and sometimes those are things where we're either trapping people in a space, giving them exactly what they need to stay exactly where they are. One of the things that I've been worried about and would love your perspective from a policy standpoint is if someone doesn't take that job today, that means they're not going to be getting that promotion 6 months from now, or they're not going to be able to move up that career ladder a year from now. From a policy standpoint, what are we learning in terms of our employment policy here in the state that might need a little tweaking or adjusting as we try to move things forward?
Yeah, Boyd, I'm glad you asked that. I've thought about that a lot, and I think it's just on the forefront of a lot of our minds. One of the things, other states are pulling back from that unemployment benefit, the additional unemployment benefits, and I see that coming from the state of Utah. And interestingly enough, Jason referenced the hospitality industry. I was just recently in St. George, and I noticed in 2 restaurants, one restaurant said, "Please forgive our service. We are short-staffed and we cannot find employees. We're hiring." And in another restaurant, they were utilizing paper plates at a sit-down restaurant, and they said, "We can't find a dishwasher." So I think from a policy standpoint, not only are we going to have to start we're training right now in high school. We're looking at programs and opportunities and funding related to training in high school, but that's not our only solution. I think from a policy standpoint, we need to be more proactive and look at other opportunities. So as we are making big deals, and I think, Art referenced some of the big deals that are happening, especially in the tech industry, where we're pulling in thousands of jobs. We have a crisis. One, we don't have the houses for people to move to. There's no inventory on the market. So, at the chamber, we are looking at the housing crisis. We're pulling together our thought leaders on how we can address that crisis. And secondly, if we don't have the workforce to fill these jobs, we have another problem. We're not going to maintain these number 1 numbers. So I think from a policy standpoint, so I'm glad you asked that, we need to start looking at policies that are going to help us with the housing market so we can build workforce housing and increase that inventory so we have some inventory on the market. And then also look at retraining, getting women back into the workforce, Holly. I think that's a critical piece that we need to look at from a policy perspective.
Yeah, wonderful. And Holly, I want to go back to that issue. I was interviewing Sid Tetro from Women's Tech Council, and they had an event this week, talking about talent and the talent shift. And she made a really interesting comment. She said that, the people you employed a year ago are not the people that are working for you today. They've changed. Yeah. And Art's point earlier that people are looking at it different, or Jason's point about, hey, people are jumping industries. And so there's some shifts there. I want to go through some of the lessons learned. To your point, Holly, you talked about this being a pause year and a challenge for a lot of women in the workforce. There's also been some good lessons in terms of what we actually can do from remote locations like our event today. What are some of the other lessons learned or things that we need to make sure we apply is I guess where we're trying to get. What lessons should we be applying to maximize everybody in the workforce?
So I think there are some great things that we have learned from the year of the shutdown. This remote work is one of those, and to have employers who support that idea, right? Who support flexibility, that you can get your job done when you can fit it in your schedule. So I mentioned right before we started, I personally get up at 4 o'clock in the morning to do my job. And it actually works out really well for me, because then the bulk of the day I can do my mom responsibilities, family responsibilities, and then I can do a little bit in the evening again. So it really, flexibility, job flexibility is really important. Childcare flexibility or childcare arrangements is also very important. And there's not a one size fits all. And that's, again, some more research from Dr. Madsen. But one of the things she said, and we should know this, right, is that families in Utah, we're not a cookie cutter one size fits all. So we have single parent families, we have large families, we have small families, we've got, I mean, we just have this wide variety. And so there's not going to be one solution that fits everything. But I think looking at how do we maximize whether it's talent or time. I know that there are, looking at the studies about women in this last year, some of the ones who expressed the most distress were teachers, actually. They felt like they were asked to do double duty. So not only were they teaching in the classroom in most locations around the state, but they were also asked to prepare online curricula for the kids who were staying at home and being taught at home. There was no additional pay, right? And then they had their own children, their own families to worry about. And so things like that, right, is how do we make it so that it's appealing, but also doable with the demands that people have in their daily lives.
Yeah, wonderful. I want to go back to Ginger. Just on that education component is also a big part of our growth path as a state. Having that educated workforce has been a big plus. Really interesting. One of our viewers, Todd, chimed in, and you can all do this if you want to ask a question of the panel or want to give me a heads up on something. You can just do that in the chat. But talking about hybrid work and virtual versus in person, what can be done in the site, what can be done from home, where people live, also could have a big benefit to many of our rural communities. Again, what are you seeing in that space?
So in terms of the work from home initiative, I think we've seen just a huge boost. Obviously we've seen that just organically through COVID, but then the hybrid model where we have the ability to come in and out of work if we choose to. I think that's been one of maybe the bonuses from COVID. From the policy standpoint, we're seeing from the executive branch on and down through the legislature a push with infrastructure. And infrastructure, namely in the realm of broadband. And I think we're seeing that that's a big need, and that will help not only, those along the Wasatch Front, but I think it will help our rural communities where people can work in our rural communities and thrive in those communities and not leave all of the time or export their children out to work in other areas. There'll be an opportunity to do some of these tech jobs and work for the businesses in Silicon Slopes remotely. And so I think that the infrastructure push right now from our state leaders is really critical to help with that remote working and hopefully help the women in our workforce, when they're doing double duty, but have that ability to have that hybrid model.
Yeah, wonderful. Art, I want to go to you, just staying on the same question for a moment, both in terms of remote. Also love that Todd pointed out that housing, more affordable housing is part of the solution, but it's not the only part of the solution. It's so easy, and I think we kind of get fed this often from the federal level, is that it's an all or nothing. We end up with a lot of false choices. And so while housing is a critical issue, clearly in the state, it's not the only part of the solution in terms of our path forward. How are you seeing that play out?
Well, just to touch on, hybrid work, remote work, one of our biggest takeaways from this public health crisis is how the workplace is a fungible concept. And not in every circumstance, certainly much more difficult for anybody in the service industry, but I'm really curious to see how this plays out, because I think 6 months ago, and in just talking to business founders, people in the investment community, there's a lot of juice for telecommuting. Remote work is this is our jam now. This is what we're going to do. I think in the last couple of months, that's softened a good deal. Boyd, I talked to you a couple of weeks ago about chatting with Jamie Dimon from JP Morgan. He was adamant about our people are going back to work. They're going to be back in the branches, back in the office. But that, and obviously JP Morgan is at the top of the pyramid, but that also spans, I've also talked to leaders of small companies. Joseph Woodbury, started this very successful Utah company, peer-to-peer storage Neighbor. He wants his people back at work too. And both of these business leaders kind of spoke to the same things. There's a missing energy and some organic, idea making and exchanges that just don't happen in this setting. But I guess on the other side of that, I had a great talk with Sid Tetro about how remote work was fitting into things she was doing, and even got to speak with an employee of hers, lives in the Midwest, was an office manager, was out of work super early on in the pandemic, had a bunch of struggles figuring out she's a primary caregiver for an elementary age student in her home, and was, struggling, in very challenged in figuring out needing to get back to work, feeling like she needed to get back to work. She talked about feeling like her just self-value was under, her sense of self and self-value was kind of under attack, or just being beaten up by these circumstances. And remote work for her ended up being this great solution to the problem that solved for multiple challenges, getting back to work, feeling good about herself, and also just navigating, as Holly mentioned, these kind of new levels of responsibility parents have at home because all our kids are home, or they're home a lot more than they used to be. So I think there's some great lessons that everybody has had, whether you're an employer or an employee, and the experience with remote work. But I think we've yet to get to the new workplace world, and I think it's going to be interesting, and hopefully there'll be a bunch of positive challenges, or positive changes, I should say, that address those very things that Ginger, Jason, and Holly have all brought up about, our employment disparities. There is a chance for remote work or hybrid work to open new paths for people who have had, trouble getting in the game before because of structural issues, right?
Sure. Awesome. Jason, let me go over to you on this. I'm going to stay with this question just a little bit longer, because I think it's really vital for everybody, especially for the chamber members. And that is, in your reporting, as you've been monitoring things, I'm one of those guys who believes that culture eats strategy for breakfast. And a lot of companies have struggled with the culture piece of this. Art alluded to it a little bit in terms of those hallway conversations, that spontaneous innovation that happens. Jason, what have you seen, both in terms of what we're losing or what we've lost in that, but also even some creative ways that you've seen businesses and organizations compensate and maintain that culture component that I think is vital to our future success?
And I want to tell you, when it first started happening, when people started going home, I asked a couple of industry leaders about that idea. You can't have collaboration, these conversations. Art knows, when we're in the newsroom, part of the reason we can do our jobs better is when we can have conversations with other people who either have information or have had some experience that we can glom onto, and then be able to use that in how we gain our information and do our stories. You don't have that at home. And Zoom meetings can help, but it certainly isn't a long-term solution, because there's something to be said for talking to somebody face-to-face, having that energy be near you. And similarly, you can't build a culture through electronic means. That's the one thing they were saying, is the reason you want to get back to work in many cases, and by that I mean into a workplace, in a workspace, is because that's how you build a culture. That's how you make people understand the ethos of a company, how you want them to operate, and how they can succeed in doing it together. Whereas when we're at home, in a lot of ways, it's every man and woman for themselves. You're just working on your particular segment of the business, and that's kind of it. When you can collaborate much more when you're in a collaborative space. I want to mention one other thing here, Boyd. When we talk about this in terms of employees, I certainly get that. What I worry about, and I've heard people talk about that I've been talking to, is all of these commercial spaces that have our offices in them. They are suffering pretty mightily now. And when those leases are up, what are they going to do? Because now our economy will be impacted by the fact that we have a lot of vacant spaces. And this is around the country, certainly here in Utah as well. We have new skyscrapers going up, and they're not going to be as many people in them in a lot of cases. Some will. How do we mitigate that as part of our continued growth strategy when we know that this hybrid model is probably going to be, at least, it may be the one thing that we get out of this that's very positive, because some people do like the flexibility of being able to be at home. But again, that cultural part, being in the office, there's something to be said for that as well.
Yeah, excellent. And I just want to add one just small note to our leaders on the call today. That often when we talk about the culture, we talk about the employees and the hallway conversations. Don't think for a minute that doesn't impact you as the business leader. It may impact you more. I've seen far too many business leaders who think they have a good finger on the pulse of what's going on. They don't have it on a good day, but then you throw in a pandemic and remote work, and they're really disconnected. And so I think there's two important lessons for leaders in your organizations. And one is to make sure you're still that person that goes in and plants the flag in your office, even if it's virtually every day, of this is who we are, this is where we're going, this is the culture and the things that we believe in. It's very easy to become disconnected as a leader, more so than ever. Used to be you could just go in your office, close the door, and be disconnected. Now you've got many, many levels of disconnect that can be really troublesome in terms of leading your business and your organization. And kind of on that same theme, let's go to you, Holly, in terms of some of the blind spots. We talk about blind spots in terms of leaders of businesses and organizations. Let's talk about it in terms of the state and trying to maintain these positive ratings, our good success. What are some of the blind spots that are on your radar that maybe the legislature or the governor's office or others may not be thinking about, that we need to sustain this excellence moving forward?
So I've already mentioned one, and that really is how we look at our data. And you know the old adage, right? There's lies, darn lies, and statistics. But I'm a social scientist researcher also, and I know that there can be really good value from the data, but I think there's value in disaggregating and looking at some more specifics. But there is one area that I think that the current executive branch is doing really well, and that's the returnship. That's a project from the lieutenant governor, and she is a non-traditional student herself. I am also a non-traditional student, go back later, right? Didn't start at 18 and graduate at 22. That was not my path. And what she has started is this whole program, and she has partnered with the business community actually to welcome back people who have been out of an educational program for, I think it's at least 2 years, but it might be somebody who enlisted in the military and now wants to further their education. Or many times it might be a mom, maybe their kids are grown now, or maybe their kids are all in school, and we've been able to send our kids back to school. And so she's looking at how to help those people re-enter the workforce who had maybe taken an off-ramp for a little while. And it may have been somebody who was a caregiver for maybe a disabled child or a parent, and now those responsibilities have ended, and so they're looking to get back on. I think everybody has kind of mentioned potential blind spots being patting ourselves on the back a little too much, right? So we know that there are disparities. We know that there are still 500,000 people in our state that are food insecure, right? I mean, there are issues in the nonprofit sector. So not all nonprofits in Utah are going to come out of this pandemic. There are nonprofits that are folding. They just were not able to continue, right? Because as you mentioned with investment, the same thing happens when you're donating to a nonprofit. You start to keep money a little closer to the chest because you're not really sure what's going to happen in the future. So we just need to be aware, right, of it's really great to be king of the mountain. And as you said, the blind spots come with that, right? And we pat ourselves on the back and say, well, look, our unemployment rate's the lowest in the nation. We're top this and top that. But there's other rankings where we're close to the bottom or at the bottom. So we have to watch those too.
Definitely got to watch those. And I'm so glad you brought up the nonprofits. That's one we're often not talking about locally or nationally, that many nonprofits are struggling. And then you start factoring in all of the good work that they do in communities, often that government can't do or isn't doing well. And that's a real area of concern. I think we've got to keep our eye on. I love the Lieutenant Governor's initiative and getting people back in. Is so good. And if anyone needs any motivation today, if you watched Phil Mickelson at almost 51 win the PGA Championship, and I noted, I think at every one of our universities in their spring graduations, we have had at least a few grandmas graduating. And
I do have to say
that.
this one thing about Phil, though, because people are talking about how old he is. I am older than that. That makes me feel ancient. I mean, come on. But yeah, I mean, I think that's something that's really important. And I think that's another thing to note with the pandemic, when you talk about education and grandmas graduating. I'm a grandma. And when I got my bachelor's degree, I was 51 and already a grandma. And now I'm 56, so it hasn't been that many years. But one of the things that the women in this study done by Dr. Madsen, one of the things that they noted is, yes, it was a pause. It was also a chance for them to reassess and say, do I really want to stay in the same type of job? Do I want to stay in this very specific job? Or is this a time for me to go back to school? And for some of them, the answer was yes. And for some of them, the answer was no. They didn't feel like it was certain enough that they could, spend the money for education. But now that there's some of these programs that are out there, I think it's like Snow College has some really great things. SUU's got some things. I mean, people are out there saying, we want to make education available for anybody who wants it. SUU has a program for a bachelor's degree for $9,000, right? That can sound like a lot, but compared to a normal cost, it's not very much. So it's looking at those things too, right? Where does the education piece fit in a longer term view of how that's going to impact the economy, like you've already mentioned?
Yeah, and that's so important for our business leaders as well, encouraging that, engaging in that. There's so many ways for our employees to upskill, to get some different experience, to be part of different programs. Really vital there. Art, let me go back to you quickly on just some of those blind spots you think that we should be thinking about, or things that are on the horizon that maybe we're not talking enough about as it relates to kind of the forward path out of the pandemic and the opening of the economy.
Yeah, I think, well, there's a few things. I think that our return to normalcy, with some big quotes around normalcy, will be reminders of the things that have maybe been put to the side a little bit, particularly anybody, commuting to Salt Lake City from Utah County, for instance, or South Salt Lake County, or vice versa. I've noticed we're inching our way back to that. I think Utah lawmakers are looking that squarely in the eye with the money they put toward public transit, and obviously a whopping big sort of potential bonding, I guess, bandwidth for infrastructure, badly needed. That all plays into these quality of life concerns. I think a lot of people are watching to see what this interesting employment environment we have right now does to wage growth. Before the pandemic, we were seeing some moderate wage growth, but I think that becomes a bigger deal as we inch past full functional unemployment and become, just in a sort of an upside down equation on that. How fast will wages move up? What's sort of an economically feasible movement on that, especially alongside housing. I think there's going to be some interesting outcomes for Utah based on federal policy changes, because right now what's good for most of the country is not good for Utah. Quite frankly, I think a lot of people would say, hey, some interest rate movement upward right now could be good for us, right? Look at what's going on in housing and consumer prices. But we know the Fed is going to continue to, or has said they will continue to hold the line until the national unemployment issues, 8 million people, 6+%. It's the quite different from our environment. So we need to like forge this path that's very Utah specific in the ways that we can. But of course, we'll be beholden and functioning under whatever federal policy changes take place. President Biden's infrastructure package obviously figures into potentially to helping us maybe address some of our issues. And housing, I just
Keep coming back to that.
terrifying. I think because people what I talk to keep coming back to it.
Yeah.
Phil Dean from the Gardner Institute, who I spoke to about it, inflation issues in federal policy, that he underscored that heavily, as many people are, and it could all even out. Supply chain issues, sawmill issues, all get figured out in 6 months. Maybe it's a rear view mirror thing, but right now people are paying more for stuff.
Yeah.
And particularly so, it's hitting sort of the mobile, young adult, fresh college graduate demographic harder than anybody else. And those are kind of the people, that's part of we want to attract more people in that category to Utah, especially skilled workers. And I'm not saying that at all, discounting the other end of our employment spectrum, which remains very important. And equity is a big deal. But there's some, it isn't going to be all rainbows and unicorns.
Never. It's never. I wish it were, but I keep waiting for the unicorns, but they have not come to my house yet. Ginger, this is I've been waiting for this. This is your chance to be czar for a day. Policy coming at it now. Utah's obviously in a unique place. As Art mentioned, there's a lot of places around the country with additional funds coming in federally that really just had to fill holes with that because they were so deep. Because we've done well, it allows us to do some things different. Would love your perspective in terms of what are some of those things, kind of those once in a generation or unique opportunities we have because we've done well, and what should we be doing strategically with that to keep that momentum moving?
Yeah, as I've been listening to all of the other panelists, one word just keeps jumping out to me, and it's growth, growth, growth. And we talk about Kim C. Gardner and all their projections on growth. We're going to double. And that sounds, great and exciting from a business perspective, but from a quality of life, I think Art mentioned the quality of life. That's a little bit scary for some of the folks here in Utah who say, keep Utah, Utah. So, I think right now, when we were discussing blind spots, one of the big things that I think is as a blind spot is water. We're in the worst drought that we've seen in years, and it's terrifying. So I really appreciate that all of this infrastructure dollars are coming in, these federal dollars, $1.6 billion. And I think that, when we're talking, let's think about legacy projects, not just one-offs. We need to be thinking about key infrastructure projects related to water and transportation, and then we cannot dismiss our air quality issues as well. So how do we talk about cleaning our air? So I think for the state, blind spots, those are all lining up for me as we're talking through a lot of this. And I was really, I felt encouraged when our state leaders put aside some of our dollars and said, let's think about this money a little bit. Let's just not do some knee-jerk reaction. Let's think about some legacy opportunities. So when there was some set aside money, I think, we've always been good with rainy day funds, and we've always been really fiscally conservative. But I think we need to be really concerned about every topic that we've discussed here, and that's growth.
Yeah, and looking at that growth and how we get to so much of that. I'm glad that, Ginger, that you mentioned water. I admit that I actually cheered out loud when the governor was on a national media outlet. They asked, what he was going to do with the federal money coming in, and he said water project, and you could just see that the hosts could not wrap their head around water and infrastructure as being strategic. So I appreciate you calling that out. And those are the kinds of things. Anything else on your horizon, Ginger, in terms of some of the policy or some of the investments that we should be making at the state level that will help our businesses continue to thrive?
Yeah, absolutely. I think we can't discount some of the legacy projects that are, the forward-thinking projects that we have as a state. The point of the mountain. I think strategically we're looking at that. And I think that's really key. And Art can no doubt weigh in on some of the thoughts on that development. but one of the biggest development projects that we'll see, right now, the way that we are consuming goods, we're talking about inflation, but we're bringing in goods in a different way. I know e-commerce is I order all the time online. So I think that, although a lot of people say, well, maybe inland port may not be the direction that we need to go, I think the inland port is something that is really forward thinking for the state. And I think as a state, we're already talking about growth and development, the redesign of the airport. These are really projects that are going to make Utah, not just the crossroads of the West, but the crossroads of the world. And I know we've heard that before, but those are some of the things that we need to be thinking about in a visionary way.
Yeah. Jason, I want to go to you in terms of how we balance some of these things. We know the inland port, they're not without controversy, but not without some good momentum and success. We know there was a deal announced this past week with the Port of Oakland as kind of one of those first mover kinds of things. But also want to make sure we're having this discussion around things that Ginger pointed out in terms of air quality, things like the airport. I'm one of those who does make the commute from Utah County around the point of the mountain and up to Salt Lake every day, and Phil Art's Pain and a few others. From your perspective, again, from the business community standpoint, in terms of how do we balance all of those things, keep Utah, but also keep Utah out in front in terms of leading the way?
Well, I'm going to go back to something Art brought up, and housing. Housing is an enormous issue here, and those lower rung, the people who are lower income, maybe working class, they have a mighty struggle ahead. The housing prices are going up, whether you're trying to rent or whether you're trying to own. It's become exceedingly difficult. When you have poor housing circumstances, stability in the people you want working for you becomes an issue. When you don't have a stable place to be, you find yourself really afraid of what your life is going to be like. That creates other kind of mental health issues. And Jim Wood with the Gardner Institute and the University of Utah has been talking about this for years. We have to figure out solutions to create opportunities so that people have affordable options. It's a very challenging problem, it really is. But if we don't do that, a lot of what we're talking about will be small almost, because we'll have, if you've been to California recently, Southern California in particular, well, I guess in Northern California too, if you're in the Bay Area, they have a homeless problem. We think we got one, go there. There are encampments. It is an enormous problem. We don't want to have that here. We don't want that instability in our just society or in our economy. So we have to address that as quickly as we can. And again, I don't have any answers. I wish I did. And I've asked a lot of people these questions, and they're again, some very smart people trying to figure it out. But I do think that it has resonated. They do understand, and particularly developers, they're trying to figure out a way to, right now they could make money building anything, but trying to figure that out for people is great. And then as Ginger mentioned about water, my concern is we have all these multi-family units going up. Where's all that water coming from? We are growing and growing and growing, and we're in the middle of a drought. I wonder what that's going to do to our infrastructure. There's a lot to be concerned about, considering how well we're doing economically.
Yeah. Ollie, I want to go to you on again, some of these other lessons as we march everything forward. And one is this area of mental health. We know it's been a struggle in Utah. It's been a struggle with our young people in the state. And I think we've seen that exacerbated, of course, over the term of the pandemic. But in terms of the business community and responsibility in terms of making sure we're creating space for our workers and for our customers and clients, for that matter, as it relates to mental health, what are some of the things on the horizon there we should be looking at?
I've seen some good initiatives, I think, from the business community, acknowledging that mental health, is an important aspect of overall health of your employees. And so they create space, not only create space, but engender conversations around mental health. They provide potentially trainings in meditation, or certainly coverage to see mental health therapists if that's something that's important. I think the acknowledgement that is an issue that's really affecting all of us, actually. It's not just our young people, it's kind of up and down the chain, right, for men and women and our youth as well. And so I think the business community that allows, or business spaces that allow, not only allow, but encourage these types of conversations to go on, that there's acknowledgement that there can be difficulties and that sometimes we need additional help, whether that's professional therapy or medication, but there's no space to say, hey, we're just going to tough it out. The toughest people here, they're the ones who just drive, but to recognize that that's not healthy and that's not sustainable. I think we have a lot of opportunity. We've certainly had a lot of discussion over collective grief over the last year and what grief can do. And grief is heavy, right? And we've talked about trauma-informed care. People are starting to have that be part of the normal vernacular. And so those are things that are super hopeful for me, that people in the business community and elsewhere are acknowledging that these are issues that are, they're common. They're becoming more and more common. They're shared across spaces, and allowing for conversations to happen around those and encouraging.
This is another one of those areas where, again, as leaders, I think it's so vital that you actually lead in this space, and even showing some of that courageous vulnerability in terms of your own mental wellness and how that impacts you and your business, your family, your community.
Those are for sure. Mm-hmm.
Yes, yeah, modeling it and making sure we're creating space for those conversations to happen. As we come down the home stretch, Art, you mentioned something earlier that I wanted to come back to, and it's this whole idea of this balance between what Utah is doing within the state as a laboratory of democracy and what's happening at the national level. I'm one of those. One day, if I am ever successful, there will be T-shirts that say "Make federalism sexy again," and that's what we're after. But Art, you see that from a unique perspective, and then I'm going to go to Ginger as well on this. That there is this tug and pull between what's happening at the federal level and what's happening in our very successful laboratory of democracy. Let's start with you, Art. What are some of those tugs and pulls, and what do we need to be careful of?
Yeah, well, I think federal monetary policy, fiscal policy is going to play largely over the next few months. We're all watching what's happening to price of consumer goods and services. I think I saw some data from Adobe Analytics recently that shows as the vaccination rate elevates, we are starting to ease off the e-commerce madness that we've all been engaging in. I think it's fair to say, there was a measure of e-commerce activity after the March stimulus checks started dispersing, and over like a 3-week period of time. And I think that's about the time the country hit around 100 million, at least initial vaccinations. There was a 3-week period where e-commerce did almost the level of the Black Friday week, fueled by our new collective comfort with buying all things online, as well as a bunch of, federal provided liquidity, which it started a fire. And e-commerce has been flying high, of course. I mean, anybody who owns Amazon stock will attest to that for you. But there is some indication that, vaccinations and comfort and a little more comfort and ease with our environmental conditions, putting people back into local stores, putting people back into airplanes, that movement hopefully will really help boost, obviously hospitality industry, travel and tourism, and arts and entertainment, quite frankly, just blown up by all the circumstances we're familiar with, isolating at home, controls on crowd gathering. But I think Utah is going to continue to stand out because of its light touch regulation. It continues to even double down on that. The last legislative session, we've got this kind of experiment going on with a new website sort of ideation place being managed by GoEd, where this regulatory sandbox concept, it really opens doors. It could further elevate Utah as a sort of a great place to be a startup, because we're helping it be a better consumer lab. And there's some downsides to that. I don't know if we all collectively want to be the rats in the next, consumer product market testing, but certainly it's, that's a legitimate concern in a couple of different areas, but that boosts us up. And we're seeing even that, I believe the Wall Street Journal coverage of our, outstanding employment performance. You've had an example couple that moved from DC to Salt Lake, and they came here for a specific opportunity, but felt fine. Like, if this thing doesn't happen, I think one member of the couple had a startup idea. He was like, if this flops, I feel super confident of being able to get a great job in Utah. And that's a really great sort of exterior interior dynamic to have. And we're going to continue to stand out because of how the state internally controls things to the degree it can. And we'll see, it could be that we're living in a new era of sort of different approach to federal regulation. We'll see how far that goes and whether it's chilling. Nothing stands out to me right now, but
okay. Awesome. Ginger, let's close out with just some of those things that you're seeing again from the federal and the state level.
Sure. So I think at a local level, one of the things that I'm really encouraged by, Salt Lake City is launching an initiative called Tech Lake City. And Jason had mentioned, this moving away from our industrial spaces and what we'll do. But that's an initiative to attract more technology companies into the city. So I think that's a smart move on behalf of the city, and the chamber is really proud to work with them on that, as well as with our life science industries, BioHive Utah, and some initiative for growth. So I think that there's some things there locally that I've been watching. But I think, Boyd, you asked about more of the federal initiatives that we're looking at, the tug and pulls. And as a state, light touch, we're always saying keep government out of our backs and out of our pockets, out of our wallets. I know that's been our initiative. But I've been watching fiscal policy. I think that's going to be have a large impact on us moving forward. All of this money and the spending is a little bit scary. And when we're saying all this money coming in locally, but I think where's that money coming from? That's obviously a worry. I've been watching the fight over the public lands. I think depending upon which administration, we'll see the public lands grow and shrink, and that has some impact on our rural communities. Been watching that as one of your tug and pulls. And I think we'll continue to see the political divide over COVID-19. I don't know when all of a sudden a mask became a political statement, but it is. And so I think that that's something that we will continue to watch as these variants are coming into our communities.
Wonderful. Well, big thanks to our panel. Thanks for everyone for joining us today. Great discussion. And to me, it always comes back to what's happening in the business community. It's entrepreneurs. We always talk about the founding fathers as these great, wise, and noble souls, which of course they were, but they were really just a bunch of entrepreneurs and business owners who were a little tired of being overtaxed and overregulated. And so we appreciate what everyone that's part of the chamber for all that you do to help keep Utah in a really extraordinary place. And I think many of the things that we've talked about today in terms of focus always precedes success. And all of our panelists have brought out such great things for us to be thinking about as business leaders. And then I would just remind everyone that the most transitory thing on the planet is success. And really success as a state and as a business community. It's not about what was, as great as those accolades are. It's not about what is, it's about what's next. And that's really where all of you as members of the Salt Lake Chamber can be such a driving force in helping us create next and making it now here in the state of Utah. So thanks to everyone for joining us. Derek, thanks for having us. And again, a big thanks to our panelists for some great insight today.